Today we want to talk about a card that was requested, and that is Artis. So, 11 provisions, 5 power, Skellige card. He's a human occultist druid. Deploy, play a 4 provision cultist from your deck. Range, whenever a unit is played, damage it by half its power. So this is a very interesting card that did see some changes. It gained some provisions when it got the deploy ability, which is quite interesting. And the deploy ability actually makes it a fairly decent tempo play. And before we get into this one, I do want to just say right off the bat that actually, I kind of think Artis is a pretty good card. Yeah, I actually have a deck with Artis, which will be the deck coming out later this week, but I actually think he's pretty decent. So let's talk about him for a minute here, though. So why do we think, well, there's two parts of his ability, right? He's got the deploy ability, which is the smaller of the two, although it does quite help his tempo. He's got the ranged, so whenever it's played, damage it by half its power. There's some obvious synergies here we'll talk about, but first of all, let's just start off nice and easy with the 4 provision cultists. So if we search Sky Cultist, and we go to 4 provisions, we have a few choices here, and there's obviously one there's one you default to, but let's mention the others. So we've got Smallblood Ravager. He's fine, but you don't really see him anymore. His value is kind of rough. And considering we're damaging by half the power when we play the unit with Artis, because he's out there, his deploy plays the unit, then the unit takes half its power, because that's what he does. So he's going to play at a 1 and then do 2, and yeah, that's not great. So he's not the best choice. Hermit's pretty decent in the deck that runs Smallblood, but not as the card you bring out with him. It's okay to bring out with him. In case you're wondering, he doesn't die from the Smallblood, right? He damages himself by 4. He's at 3, and then the Artis damages him down to 1. So he doesn't actually kill himself. I believe that's how it works. It was in this deck. I believe that's how it works out. But he doesn't kill himself, which is nice. But it's not the best choice. And then Smallblood Butcher, you don't really see at all. And Smallblood Cultist is okay, but again, not really a synergy. And you all saw this coming. We're talking about Smallblood Fanatic. It's got Berserk 2 transformed to Bear Abomination, and this is what gives these Artis his tempo, right? You play Artis, you play this with Artis. He does it, which is half its power. It goes down to a 2, triggers the Berserk 2, turns into a Bear Abomination. So it just comes down Artis comes down to 5, it plays this for a 6, and that's an 11-point play, which is really interesting considering it's giving you a pretty decent engine too. And that's actually really good. So it's a really good tempo play, which is quite surprising coming from something with such a potentially strong engine value. But that's the 4 provision cultist part. Smallblood Fanatic's definitely the one you want to go with. And you could run the others in your deck, and if you drew the Smallblood Fanatics or something, you could play them. But usually you don't want to be playing the Fanatic. Now, this is the interesting part of the ability here. Whenever a unit's played, damage it by half its power. This obviously has some, well, actually has quite a few Skellige implications here. So the first thing we'll talk about is healing. So you can heal the damage. And we'll talk about real quick here, one of my favorite cards in the game, the Half-Roof Singer. So it has the ability to heal. And then every time you heal a unit, you spawn the Deafening Siren. So this comes down as 8. I might do a video on this card by itself at some point. But this comes down for 8. You count the healing and spawning the Siren. So this card goes quite well if you're adding more healing into your deck, right? On top of the fact this plays for 8, it also gives you 2 points a turn as long as you're healing. So this card, I think, is quite underestimated. But you have this. You have the Hermit, which also heals. So this is mostly just talking about synergies here. But as far as things to actually heal your stuff up after you do the damage with the Artis, the best ones are going to be, well, first we mentioned Veteran. You just play Veteran, it heals itself back up to 8. That's nice. The same thing with the Fanatic. If you have the other one in your hand, it does that as well. Wildkarl, you play it, goes down to the Berserk 2, because the damage rounds up. So half of 5 rounds up to 3. It triggers his Berserk, and then you get a 12-point unit. It means you don't have to leader charge the Wildkarl, but that does mean you want to find value from those leader charges elsewhere. It's not too big a deal as long as you're running the Tier Sec Veteran, because you just put the charges into him. So obviously we have some value here from these Berserks. And then you can get, not from Berserks, from his Berserk. And then we have the Heme Flamennica. If you're playing a lot of stuff that's getting damage, you can throw her out, heal up a bunch of them. It's kind of hard to fit her into these decks. You gotta remember, when she's played, she also loses half her power if Artis is out already. If you play her before Artis, this isn't as big a problem. But if you play her after Artis, she goes down to 3. 3 is pretty easy to remove, and they'll kind of stop you. But you can still get a turn of healing out that way. That's not too bad. And Joanna, you don't see Joanna Potentially you could use a Joanna, but you don't really see her ever. Yeah, never seen this card. Long time. And then we have Restore. So Restore is an interesting one, right? It does heal, so if you have a big unit you play, and an Artis damages it down, you can use the Restore ability, and then you can heal it up, and then boost it again. It's not too bad. But the point is here, you do have options to heal up the damage. I would say the best ones are probably the Half-Root Singers, Filmenica if you can fit her in, and maybe a Restore. But you do have some healing options here which you can use. And before you do this real quick, there is also the one neutral healing you can use Old-Geared, but no one's going to play Old-Geared. The other Old-Geared as well. But the other one we talk about neutral is the ability to reset. So, I mentioned Yrden. If everything you play is damaged by half by Artis, and then you just reset all of your units, you're restoring all that lost power. This does not synergize very well with healing if you're doing the healing aspect of it. But if you want to run Yrden, you can run Yrden and have a backup option to reset your damaged cards by Artis if you want. I'm not sure it's worth planning on doing that, but it's an option. And there's a couple other cards. The one I want to mention here is Spores. Spores is a 4% tech card you can run in a lot of decks. It's quite good against people running the Ring of Favor. So if you're going up with a lot of Ring of Favor decks, you can throw this in there, and then you can save it, and if you don't have a good use for it, you can throw it on something damaged by Artis. It's not the best use for it. You can use it on something like Melusine after its order's been going a whole bunch. You can use it on a similar card as well, but you do have that option. So that's kind of how we can mitigate. So we kind of talked about what we talked about, mitigating the effect of the Artis damage on yourself. We talked about taking advantage of it with the Berserks. And there's a couple other cards to mention that do take quite good advantage of Artis's ranged ability. By the way, it's worth mentioning it is ranged, so if you're having trouble, if the opponent plays it, you can move it. If you're playing it, you can expect them to move it if they think it's going to be a problem. But some people won't bother removing this, which is interesting, but we'll talk about the ranged bit a little bit. Yeah, it's just ranged. It's not that complicated. He just is ranged, which is, most people, like I said, most people just don't bother removing Artis, which I find a little odd, because there's definitely going to get more value for you than it will for them. But there's a couple other cards that do actually synergize quite well with this ability. One of them being Arnagad. So, Arnagad gains armor for every damage you do. This is really where it comes in. If you can damage a whole bunch of things with Artis, which is quite easy, right? So you have play Artis, they don't answer it, they play like 3 units, you play like 3 or 4 units. Let's say you each play 4, for example, and maybe you damage a couple other guys. Say they have like 6 damage units, you have like 4, that's 10. He gets 10 armor. And then the armor blocks all the damage from the Artis on him, and he still has a bunch of armor left. And Arnagad fits very well in these Artis decks, because you do get the armor, you get his value, and he fits really well in those decks. Not much to say about that other than that. Mentioning as well, if we take a look at Olaf, Olaf is interesting. The problem with Olaf is if you damage him with Artis, he goes down to 5. And at 5, they remove him before he can use his order. However, if you can make sure it doesn't happen, maybe the defender, then this actually becomes quite valuable. And you can also do that before using something like your leader charges on it. Before clicking its ability, you could do that as well. It does anti-synergize with Olaf him combo, because you normally want the Olaf to be at 9 when you do that. But Olaf's a decent card you can do that with. And there are a couple more. We'll come back up here in a minute. Let's scan down real quick, see if there's any others I want to mention before we talk about the one that I quite like. Oh, Sigvald, obviously. He blocks the damage on him, and you're running self-wound, so you could justify a Sigvald in the deck. That's another one. Do have to be careful with some of the ones that have Berserk destroy themselves or things like that. You can trigger the Drummond Berserker right away, so he just comes down as a 6-point card. And he doesn't lose as much power as some other cards would by taking half damage, but it's also not fantastic, really. Playing Warrior is pretty good. Playing this is okay. It also sets up the Bear Witcher Mentors quite nicely. When I mentioned healing, I don't think I mentioned Aaron Kaduk. So you can do this, right? This heals. You can run this as well, and it does make the Bear Witcher Mentor. If a lot of stuff's damaged by the Artist, you can get value from this. A lot of value. So worth mentioning that. as well. But I think that's most of the cards that we want to talk about that get good value here. I think so. You can obviously, like, some cards gain value where, like, Jakar will block some of the damage with his armor, actually all the damage with his armor, and plays a 5. But it depends. None of these are stellar. None of the other ones right here are stellar. So I'm forgetting something. If I'm forgetting something, always let me know. But there is one more card we skipped over earlier that I want to really bring up with this. And that's Sucrus. Sucrus, however you say him. And the unit to his left doesn't take damage. Now, there's the obvious combo with this and Arnagod. If Arnagod's out and you play Sucrus, we're just going to call him Sucrus. Sorry if I'm pronouncing his name wrong. Usually I check the pronunciation of the names before I make one of these videos. I forgot we were talking about him, though. So, yeah. We have him. And the reason why, y'all know the Sucrus Arnagod combo. Play this next to it, usually behind Defender, and then Arnagod just does 7 damage to everything the opponent plays and doesn't take any damage. So, against cards with Order, against cards with Deploy. Deploy is worse, against cards with Order it's really good. I played a game earlier today where I threw this down against a Traveling Priestess deck round 2, and their Traveling Priestess had 36 charges, 34 charges, I think. It was 30-something charges, and they played it, and it died to Arnagod, and they left the game. You could do stuff like that with it, and it synergizes quite well. Arnagod synergizes quite well with Artis, doing damage to everything. Sucrus damages really well with Arnagod, and he also synergizes quite well with the Artis, and the reason why is if you prevent the unit from not taking any damage, you just, as long as he's alive, you can kind of just ignore Artis' effect on you. So your Artis is ranged, you have the Sucrus out, maybe you even have it next to the Artis to start with, then you play something next to, when you play your card, you just play on the left of Sucrus, and then they just don't take damage, so you can kind of just ignore Artis' effect on you, and it only affects your opponent. And if it's only affecting your opponent, Artis is very strong. That's kind of what this comes down to, right? He's very strong if he's only affecting your opponent, or if you're taking advantage of it. And it's also an 11-point play on, like 11 for 11 on deploy. It's not bad. Like, I actually think Artis is a pretty good card. But Sucrus, Arnagod, I would definitely run. Oh, by the way, the Covenant of Steel also combos quite well with him, because that 2 armor does block. So, Covenant of Steel takes 4 damage from Artis. That 2 of it's blocked on the armor, and then she starts getting her armor back every turn. So, it's actually really not bad at all with the Artis. So, you have, if you have the Artis out already, you play this, it's a 5, it starts getting the armor back, because it's got the Bloodthirst ability, the Berserk ability, not Bloodthirst. And that's quite nice. And like I said just a second there, Bloodthirst, you are going to be damaging a lot of things with your Artis. So you could use some of the Bloodthirst cards. There's several here. Obviously, these are all the Bloodthirst ones. None of them I find super compelling to run in an Artis deck. Yeah, I just don't, because usually you don't run Warriors, and there's a bunch of Warriors here. Honestly, guys, I didn't even know this ability existed for this Bloodthirst too. Did not know that existed. It's kind of funny, but the things you learn. Things you learn. Anyway, none of these synergize super well, because you're not always guaranteeing the Artis will damage stuff, and a lot of these are Warrior synergistic. But it's worth mentioning the Bloodthirst cards here. It is worth mentioning them. So yeah, basically, Artis is an 11 for 11 on deploy. As long as his ability range is benefiting you more than the opponent, either from you gaining value from healing, you gaining value from resetting your cards, you gaining value from the Berserk abilities, which are all very possible, or you're just ignoring it completely by having Sucrus out, setting up your Arnagod. There's a lot of ways Artis is actually pretty good. I wouldn't say he's one of the strongest cards, but he's definitely worth a consideration. If you've never played around with Artis before, I'd actually kind of recommend it. He's quite fun. You can set up some pretty nifty combos. Worth mentioning as well that anything that's 1 power will die when you have Artis out, because it rounds up for the half damage. So that's worth mentioning. Colgrim dies if you're an Artis out. Haven't had that happen quite yet, but it would be pretty funny. So it's worth mentioning that. I think Artis is pretty good. Like, if he plays for 11 points, if you're gaining value from his ability, the opponent isn't, It's really good. This is also worth mentioning here is stuff like relics with very tall cards. If the opponent's cards are taller on average than yours, on average they're taking more damage than you, and that's good for you. So that's also a thing worth pointing out. Maybe you don't want to run super tall cards here. The biggest example of this is if you're playing well, this is actually kind of an example, combines with Restore. If you're playing Melusine, and you boosted up Melusine, you have Artis out, and you revive the Melusine with Fuchsia, she plays the Skellige unit, so you have a 30-point Melusine, and then your Artis damages it by 15. Not ideal, but then you can Restore if you're running Renew. Or Restore if you're running Restore. So that is one last thing to mention about this. You could try and go for a combo like that. I wouldn't really recommend it, but you could. But yeah, that's Artis. Deck on him will be coming out later this week. I think he's a pretty decent card. His value on deploy for the Fanatic, coming down for 11 points, is really good. And if there were a couple more, like there's a good number of fairly decent Berserk cards. So like you've got the Cheerstic Veteran, which is pretty good with them because it still plays for 8. You don't even have to worry about damaging it down. The Artis will do that for you, just plays for 8, which is nice. This one's really good. The Fanatic's pretty good with him. And then the Wildclara, those are the best ones with him. If there were like 1 or 2 more, maybe just 1 more Bronze Berserk card that got a lot of value from triggering the Berserk, I think we might see Artis become more common, right? It's hard to say, but he is quite an interesting card. One I think is underrated. And let me know what you guys think. Do you like Artis? Have you played around with him? You found him to be good? I think he's pretty good. Are you excited to see a deck on him? Let me know. And as always, let me know what card you want to see in the next one. That'll be it for this one, guys. Hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next time. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more. And you can check out some more videos over here. And thanks for watching.